My husband packed his bag while I slept. I was 8 months pregnant. He had been planning it for weeks. I know that now. While I was buying baby clothes and painting the nursery and believing we were building something, he was building a way out. He left on a Thursday morning without looking at my stomach once. 3 days later, he came back. With her. Stood in my kitchen and told me the house was in his name and I needed to leave. 8 months pregnant. Nowhere to go. And a village full of people who watched it happen and couldn't wait to talk about it. I left with one bag, £300, and a photograph I found at the bottom of my dead father's box. A rusted ship on a rocky coastline. 3 words on the back in his handwriting. "This is yours." I had no idea what that meant, but I had nothing left to lose. So I went to find out. If you've ever had everything taken from you by someone who was supposed to protect you, stay until the end. Because what I found on that ship is something I will never stop being grateful for. Subscribe, hit the like button, and don't go anywhere. The village knew by the weekend. That is the thing about small places. They know everything, and they know it quickly, and they know it in a way that gets slightly worse with each telling. By Saturday, I could see it in the way the woman at the post office looked at me. By Sunday, it was in the way conversation stopped when I walked into the shop. A pregnant woman whose husband had left her for someone younger. That was the story. That was what I had become. I had loved Thomas since I was 22 years old. We had met at a dance in the town hall on a rainy November evening, and he had made me laugh 3 times in the first 10 minutes, and I had thought, this one. I had thought it with the absolute certainty of someone who doesn't yet know how badly certainty can fail you. 4 years. I had given him 4 years and a pregnancy and the kind of trust that you only give once, completely, without keeping anything back for yourself. And he had packed a bag while I slept. I lay in my mother's spare room at night, and I cried in the way you cry when you don't want anyone to hear, quietly into the pillow, with the particular discipline of a woman who has decided that the daylight hours are for functioning, and the dark is the only place she can afford to fall apart. The baby moved while I cried. Slow, rolling movements, as if she knew something was wrong and was trying to say, I am still here. I am still here. I held on to that. In the mornings, I got up and I washed my face, and I went through my father's box again because there was something in that photograph I couldn't stop thinking about. My father died when I was 9 years old. A fishing accident off the north coast. The same water he had trusted his whole life. He was 34. I don't have many complete memories of him. Mostly fragments. The smell of his coat when he came home. His voice reading to me at night, low and unhurried. The way he laughed at things other people didn't find funny. What I remember most clearly is a Saturday afternoon when I was 7. He took me to the coast, further north than we usually went, down a track that ended at a rocky inlet, where the sea came in quietly between 2 headlands. And there, half-beached on the rocks, was a ship. Old, rusted, settled into the coastline, as if the land had decided to keep it. I asked him whose it was. He looked at it for a long time before he answered. Then, he said, "It belonged to your grandfather, and one day it will belong to you." I didn't understand. I was 7. I asked if we could climb on it. He said not today. He said one day. He died 2 years later, and one day never came. I had filed it away with the other fragments, the coat, the voice, the laugh, as something that belonged to a life that had ended before I was old enough to understand it. But my father had kept this photograph. He had written those 3 words on the back of it deliberately. He had put it at the bottom of a box that he knew I would eventually go through. My father never did anything without a reason. My mother thought I had lost my mind when I told her I was going to find the ship. She said, "You are 8 months pregnant." I said, "I know exactly how pregnant I am." She said, "Margaret." I said, "I'll be careful." She looked at my stomach, then at my face. Then she made tea, which was what she did when she'd lost an argument and wasn't ready to admit it. The next morning I got on the bus north. The track down to the inlet was steeper than I remembered. I had been 7 the last time I walked it, which meant I had been small enough that steep didn't register the way it registered now. Now, with a body that had redistributed its weight in ways I was still negotiating, and a back that had been filing complaints for 3 weeks, and ankles that my midwife had looked at and said nothing about in the particular way, that meant she was thinking something she had decided not to say. I took it slowly, one hand on the rock face beside me, stopping when I needed to stop. The baby was quiet, which I chose to interpret as cooperation rather than concern. By the time I reached the bottom, my back was burning and I was sweating despite the cold, and I had stopped twice to breathe through the particular tightening across my abdomen. That wasn't quite a contraction, but was close enough to make me aware of exactly what my body was capable of doing without my permission. And then I saw it. It was larger than I remembered. The hull rose out of the water at an angle, rusted red and brown, barnacled at the waterline, the deck tilted but intact. The name on the bow was almost gone. 2 letters visible, the rest eaten by decades of salt and weather. I stood at the edge of the inlet and looked at it and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of standing in front of something that has been waiting for you, that has always been waiting for you, and finally being there. Then I looked at the ladder on the starboard side and understood that the hard part hadn't started yet. The ladder was rusted and half detached from the hull, angled outward at the bottom in a way that meant the first rung required a step up and outward simultaneously. I stood at the base of it for a long time. I tried 3 times before I got on it. The first time I got my hands on the second rung and felt the ladder shift under my weight and stepped back immediately. My heart was going too fast, and the baby had moved into a position that pressed against my ribs when I reached upward, and I stood with my back against the hull, and breathed, and told myself very clearly that I could go back. That nobody was making me do this. That the bus went south in 2 hours, and my mother's spare room was narrow and cold, but it was safe, and the baby was coming in 4 weeks, regardless of what I found on this ship. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then I tried again. I tried. The second attempt got me 3 rungs up before the ladder groaned in a way that sounded structural, and I froze, arms shaking, belly pressed against the hull, face against cold rust, and talked myself down 1 careful rung at a time. The third attempt I went slowly, impossibly slowly. 1 rung. Wait. Test. 1 more. The ladder held. My arms burned. Every time I reached upward, the baby pushed back against the stretch, and I breathed through it and kept going, and did not look down, and did not think about anything except the next rung, and then the next one, and then the one after that. When I finally rolled onto the deck, I lay flat on my back for a full minute, staring at the grey sky, 1 hand on my stomach, breathing. The baby kicked hard once. I said out loud, I know, we're here now." The deck tilted at an angle that made every step a negotiation. I moved slowly, 1 hand always on something solid, testing each board before I trusted it with my weight. The wood had rotted in places, soft sections that gave slightly underfoot. And I learned to read the deck the way you learn to read any unreliable surface, by feel and by instinct and by not rushing. The hatch to the lower deck was rusted shut. I found an iron bar lashed to the deck railing and worked at the hatch for longer than I wanted to admit. My arms were already exhausted from the ladder. My back had moved beyond pain into a kind of white noise, that I had learned to function inside. The baby had gone still, which I chose to interpret as solidarity. The hatch gave on the 7th attempt, with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for 40 years, finally exhaling. Below, darkness. The smell of salt and rust and something else underneath everything. Something dry and enclosed that didn't belong on a ship that had been sitting in seawater for decades. The ladder down was fixed to the hull, and solid. Going down was easier than going up had been. Gravity was finally working with me rather than against me. I went one rung at a time, facing the ladder, moving carefully, and when my feet touched the lower deck, I stood still and let my eyes adjust to the dimness. Light came through 2 portholes. Green-grey, filtered enough. The hold was divided into sections. The first 2 were open to the sea. Waterlogged, the cargo long since destroyed. But the 3rd section had a door. A proper door. Wooden frame, iron latch, sealed from the outside. Someone had locked this room deliberately, and left. I lifted the latch, put my shoulder against the door, pushed. It opened. The smell that came out stopped me completely. Not rot, not salt, paper. Dry paper. The warm, dusty smell of documents, kept sealed for a very long time. The room was small, 4 feet by 6, built into the stern, positioned exactly where the ship's angle kept it above the waterline. Whoever had built it had understood the ship completely, had known precisely where the water would never reach. My father had been a fisherman. He had known ships, and his father before him. Along one wall, a wooden shelf, 2 bundles of documents wrapped in oilskin, tied with cord gone stiff with age. I couldn't crouch. My body had made that impossible weeks ago. I stood with my feet apart for balance, the stance I had developed for unreliable surfaces and unreliable days, and lifted the first bundle down and worked the cord loose with fingers that were trembling slightly. Not from cold, from something else entirely. The first document was a registration certificate, a cargo vessel named the Margaret Rose. Owner, William Harold Cassidy. My grandfather. I kept going. Maintenance records, cargo manifests. A survey report from 1947 noting the vessel had run aground and been assessed as non-recoverable. And then, near the bottom, a transfer of ownership document, dated 1952. My grandfather transferring the vessel and all associated rights to his granddaughter. My name, my full name, in my grandfather's handwriting. I had been 11 years old in 1952. My father had been dead for 2 years. I needed to sit down. There was nowhere to sit, no chair, no crate, nothing except the floor. Under any other circumstances, I would have managed without. But my legs had decided the matter independently, and I went down slowly, one hand on the shelf, the other on the wall, lowering myself in stages until I was on the floor of that locked room, with my back against the hull, and my legs stretched out in front of me, and my grandfather's document in both hands. Getting up was going to be a problem I would deal with later. For now, I sat in the dry silence of a room that had been waiting for me for 40 years, and I read my own name over and over until the words stopped moving. Outside, the sea moved against the hull, slow and steady, patient the way the sea always is. Block O, 7 getting up took 10 minutes and most of my remaining dignity. I tried 3 times. The first time I got halfway, and my arms gave out and I had to start again. The second time, I made it to one knee before the baby shifted position, in a way that knocked my balance completely, and I had to lean against the wall and breathe through it. The third time, I used the shelf with both hands, pushed with everything I had left, and made it upright. I stood in that small room for a moment, documents held against my chest, back against the hull, and I thought about Thomas. not with the crying grief of the nights in my mother's spare room. Something different, something colder and more focused. He had stood in my kitchen with another woman and explained reasonably and calmly that I needed to leave. He had calculated exactly what I had and what I didn't have, and he had been so certain of his arithmetic. £312, a narrow bed in my mother's house, a village full of people who were already talking. He had no idea about this room. He had no idea about any of it. I tucked the documents inside my coat, against my body, where they would stay dry and safe for the journey back. Then I went back through the door, latched it behind me, and started toward the ladder. Getting back up through the hatch was the hardest physical thing I had ever done. My arms were spent, and my back was beyond negotiating with, and the baby had opinions about every movement I made. I went up one rung at a time, stopping, breathing, continuing. There was a moment halfway up when I genuinely didn't know if I was going to make it. I made it. I rolled onto the deck and lay on my back again looking at the grey sky, and I said very quietly, to my grandfather and my father and anyone else who might be listening, I found it. I don't know yet what it means, but I found it. The wind came off the water. I got up and went home. The village was still talking when I got back. I could feel it when I walked to the shop the next morning. The slight pause in conversations, the looks that lasted a fraction too long, the particular kindness of people who feel sorry for you and want you to know it without saying so directly. Margaret Cassidy, pregnant and abandoned. That was the story. That was what I was now. I let them talk. I had other things to think about. I found Aldous through the harbour master's office in the nearest town, a retired maritime official who knew more about salvage law than most solicitors and charged considerably less. His office was small and smelled of pipe tobacco and old charts, and he had the manner of a man who had heard stranger things than whatever you were about to tell him. I put the documents on his desk. I told him everything: the photograph, the inlet, the ladder, the locked room. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he read through the document slowly, asked 2 precise questions, and then sat back and looked at me. I told him I had £300. I told him directly the way I had learned that directness was faster than embarrassment. He looked at the documents again, then at me. Then he said, I have a daughter your age. I'll take £20 for the consultation, and we'll call the rest a debt you can settle when this is resolved. He wasn't being charitable. He had read the documents, and he knew what they were worth, and he was making a calculated decision. I understood that, and I respected it, and I said yes. Then he told me about salvage rights, about the cargo manifest from 1945, about what my grandfather had been carrying when the Margaret Rose ran aground: industrial copper, navigational instruments, precision engineering components, stored, Aldous noted carefully, in a sealed compartment specifically constructed to keep them dry. My grandfather had built that room himself, before he ran aground, as if he had known. The baby came 3 weeks later, a Tuesday morning, faster than anyone expected, in my mother's spare room because there wasn't time to get to the hospital. My mother delivered her with the focused calm of a woman who had decided decades ago that panicking was a luxury she couldn't afford. I named her Rose, after the ship. I held her in that narrow bed, and I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since Thomas left. Not the quiet, disciplined crying of the nights, but something complete and overwhelming that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been holding herself together for 2 months through sheer will and has finally been given permission to stop. My mother sat beside the bed and said nothing. She held my hand. That was enough. The village, of course, talked about that too. Margaret Cassidy's baby, born without a father present, in her mother's spare room. I heard the version second-hand, the way you always do in small places. I let them talk. I was busy. Aldous handled everything while I recovered. The salvage assessment took 6 weeks. The copper was intact. 20 years in salt water had darkened it, but not damaged it, copper being one of the few metals that survives the sea with its value more or less preserved. The navigational instruments and engineering components were in the sealed room exactly as my grandfather had left them, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. The instruments went to a maritime museum in Edinburgh. The engineering components went to a firm in Newcastle that had been searching for exactly that specification for 3 years. The copper was sold to an industrial buyer through Aldous' contacts. I was in my mother's kitchen feeding Rose when Aldous called with the final number. I sat down very slowly. Rose kept feeding, entirely unconcerned. I said, "Say that again." He said it again. The village had been talking about what I didn't have. They had no idea what I did have, and I wasn't ready to tell them yet. But I was nearly ready. I bought a house in April, a stone cottage 1/2 mile from the coast, with a garden and a south-facing window in the kitchen and enough rooms that Rose would never have to share if she didn't want to. It was in my name. Only my name. I checked 3 times before I signed. The village noticed. Of course it noticed. A woman who had been abandoned and pitied and talked about for 5 months suddenly buying a house, not renting, buying outright, with no husband and no visible means, was the kind of thing that travelled fast in a small place. I watched the story change in real time. The looks that had been pitying became curious. The conversations that had stopped when I walked in started including me again. I didn't explain. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Thomas heard about it through people who had known us both. I know this because he came to find me on a Saturday morning in May, 3 weeks after I moved in. He drove up in his car, the same car he had taken when he left, and knocked on the door of a house he had never seen and had no part in. I opened the door with Rose on my hip. He looked at her first. Something moved across his face that I didn't try to read. Then he looked at the house behind me. The repaired gate, the clean windows, the garden I had started clearing. He looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting to find one thing and found something else entirely and was still working out what it meant. He said, "I heard you'd done well for yourself." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the kitchen, the bag he had packed while I slept, the way he hadn't looked at my stomach when he left. I said, "Yes." He said, "I thought perhaps we could talk. About things." I said, "There's nothing to talk about, Thomas. You were very clear about what you wanted." He tried once more, something vague about circumstances changing, about things being different now. I listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has spent 5 months learning exactly what she is capable of and no longer needs anyone else's assessment of it. Then I said, "You left me 8 months pregnant and asked me to get out of my own home. Whatever you're looking for, it isn't here." I closed the door. Rose looked at the closed door. Then at me. Then she made the small sound she made when she wanted feeding, and I carried her to the kitchen and fed her and looked out the window at the garden and the coast beyond it and felt something settle in me completely. He had driven away by the time I looked again. Epilogue. I still live in that cottage. Rose is 7 now and has her great-grandfather's eyes and her great-great-grandfather's complete indifference to being told something is impossible. She knows the story of the ship. I told her early and I told her often, not as a fairy tale but as a fact. This is where we came from. This is what your great-grandfather left us. This is why we are here and not somewhere else. Last October, I took her to the inlet for the first time. She is the same age I was when my father took me. I had thought about that on the drive north, about the circularity of it, about the things that pass between generations without anyone quite planning them to. She stood at the edge of the water and looked at the ship for a long time without speaking. It is lower now than it was 5 years ago. The sea has been patient and thorough. Another 10 years and there won't be much left above the waterline. Then, Rose said, "Can we climb on it?" I said, "Not today." She looked at me. I said, "One day." She accepted this with the seriousness of a child filing something away for later. We stood there together for a while, the two of us, looking at the rusted hull and the water moving around it, and the sky going grey in the way it does on the north coast in October. And I thought about my grandfather sealing those documents in that room in 1952, and my father keeping the photograph and writing those 3 words on the back of it, and the chain of intention that had run from them to me through all the years in between. They had never met Rose, but they had known her name before she was born, in the way that people know things they have planned for without knowing exactly what they are planning. I thought about Thomas occasionally, less and less as the years passed. The last I heard, he had moved to another town and was working in sales, and that was the entirety of what I knew, and the entirety of what I needed to know. The ship is mine. The cottage is mine. Rose is mine. Everything I have, I found myself. In a locked room on a ruined ship on a rocky inlet on the north coast of England, 8 months pregnant, alone, with rust on my hands and a baby pushing against my ribs, and a grandfather I never knew who had trusted me to come looking. I came looking. That was always going to be enough. If this story stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Was it the ladder, the locked room? The moment I opened the door and smelled paper instead of salt? Stories like this one don't make the news, but they happen. In ruined ships, in locked rooms, in photographs left at the bottom of boxes by people who loved us more carefully than we ever knew. New story every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.